Thursday evening, folks, and welcome to Hurricane Hub Live, streaming on 13 News Now app, as well as our tropical Tegna stations all across the country. Tonight, we're joining you from a different studio, our streaming studio, because we're going to start off today's show a little bit different with a guest to talk about today's El Nino report released from NOAA. We're going to get into depth on that. And, of course, get into the Atlantic and the Pacific, the current conditions going on there a little bit later on. I'm Chief Meteorologist Tim Pandajis. Let's get to our guest. Let's bring him on now. His name is Matthew Rosencrans. He's the El Nino expert over at NOAA. Good evening, Matthew. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, taking time out of your day. I know it's been a busy day with that hurricane outlook release for you.
Yeah, it has been. Definitely a lot of stuff to communicate after the big ENSO update this morning, or El Nino update this morning.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. So NOAA released their report. El Nino is here, and it is now forecast to develop rapidly and become possibly strong to even very strong as we approach the peak of the hurricane season in September. I want to hear your take on this, like the big takeaways from the report released, and also if you're impressed by how quickly this El Nino is kind of coming to fruition.
Yeah, so we have an El Nino advisory out now. What is kind of striking to me is just the certainty with which almost every model that we have, that we run, or that we collect from our partners, right, at NASA or the European Center, partners in Canada. So we run hundreds of simulations of the planet in partnership with them. And none of them have us, going back even towards ENSO neutral or anything. They're just, kind of going towards the state of El Nino. And that gives us a 63% chance of being in a very strong El Nino, which is pretty incredible. We haven't been doing the probabilities of the strengths for too long as a formal forecast product, but this is the highest I've seen since we've been doing it behind the scenes.
Wow. So in terms of seeing the strength of this, or the forecast strength, can you think of any analog years or comparative years that you've seen something similar to this, or is this kind of, in your opinion, unprecedented?
So there's both analogs and unprecedented natures to both of it, right? That's the cool part of doing this job, right? Like you can see a lot of stuff, but no two situations are exactly the same. So 2015, 2016, 1997 to 1998. So really the first years of those two would be equivalent to where we are now, right? So 2015, we were about on par with where we are now. There was a little bit ahead. That was 1.0 to 1.2 degrees above normal during June. We are now at 0.7 degrees above normal for the last week, so the first week of June. So we're a little behind 2015. But probably on par with 1997 as far as just the El Nino. When you take into account the rest of the sea surface temperatures in the globe, no other year kind of looks exactly like this year. So there'll be some slightly different impacts, even if the El Nino area is exactly the same.
Let's go back to the basics real quick, and for our viewers that maybe don't understand exactly what El Nino is and what brings it on, the ENSO circulation. Can you explain exactly what we're talking about? What part of the world that's nowhere close to the U.S. that's actually going to have huge implications for U.S. weather going forward?
Yeah, so when we talk about ENSO and El Nino, we're talking about winds and temperatures. So winds over the Pacific Ocean, well out near the date line, so almost around the entire planet from most of the U.S., and then sea surface temperatures in that same area. When we're going to an El Nino, like we have now, it means that the sea surface temperatures basically due south of Hawaii, right at the equator, are becoming anomalously warm. Then when you change those sea surface temperatures there, you increase the amount of thunderstorms coming off of those waters. And I'm not just talking about a small area. It's an area of the ocean that's 5,000 miles wide. That's the area that we're analyzing. And so you're taking 5,000 miles worth of warm water, creating thunderstorms over the top of them in an area where you don't normally get that. And then that has to push all of that rising air, those thunderstorms has to push out to the side. It goes north and south. And then that air moving north will eventually turn into the jet stream. And that will make a southern branch of the jet stream come over top of, from California to Texas and across to Florida. It'll make that more active during the winter, and even wrapping up the East Coast. So you can get some of those storms that kind of move out of the Gulf across Florida, and then can bring some pretty active weather up into the Tidewater area.
Now, question for you, Matthew. What triggers an El Nino event or a La Nina event? Like, what tilts us in either direction? Is there something that happens overall that's kind of the first signal to that?
So one of the first signals in going from a La Nina to an El Nino, we start to see westerly winds anomalies. Over the Western Pacific. So most of the times you're in the tropics, you have those easterly breezes, right? We see pictures of the Caribbean and its beautiful islands, and Hawaii have the swaying palm trees, and the winds are from east to west. What we first see is that over the Western Pacific, we'll start to see those trade winds really slacken. They'll become low, and they'll go, or sometimes they even reverse and become from the west. When that happens, the water in the ocean underneath that can kind of just start to move back with those winds. There's not as much force pushing that water, piling it up in the Western Pacific. So when those winds slacken, you let that water kind of slosh back towards the Central Pacific, and then you can move the thunderstorms over top of that warm water. Those thunderstorms will start pulling in more winds from the west, which pushes the water further to the east. And then you can bring in, and that can be one of the ways that we get into El Nino. There's a couple of other ways that it happens. So that's what the cool part of the science is. We're still trying to figure out exactly, the one thing that can trigger it, but there may be two or three.
Gotcha. Now, in regard to hurricane season, so yesterday we talked with Dr. Klossbach over at Colorado State University. They had issued their second of their 4 updates for the hurricane season outlook, downgrading their expectations because of the potential of the strong El Nino. Now, with your research, are you seeing similar things? Are you expecting a big implication on the hurricane season? Or is it going to be one of those types of years like in 2023 where we've had this sea surface temperatures kind of negate the effects of a rather moderately strong El Nino?
Yeah, so the outlook that the team put together team from NOAA put together, 8 to 14 named storms. So that's named tropical storms and subtropical storms. That is pretty low. The lower end of that, 8 storms, is what we saw during 1997 to 1998. We saw it in 1997. So that kind of anchored us on that low end. They only had 8 named storms, 3 hurricanes, and 1 major hurricane, and 45 for the accumulated cyclone energy. And that kind of anchored the lower end of our forecast range that the team put together this year. We are not seeing the warmth in the Atlantic this year, though. 2023 had a very warm Atlantic. It was 1.2 degrees above normal. This year, the Atlantic is only 0.2 degrees above normal. So much closer to normal in the Atlantic. I'm not seeing that warmth that could really overcome the effects of El Nino damping down on the hurricane activity in the Atlantic.
Gotcha. Now, in terms of, so the Atlantic would have a lower storm total because of the wind shear increase. Now, with the Eastern Pacific, though, obviously with the addition of the warm water from the El Nino event, could this possibly increase the threat for Hawaii or even perhaps the far southwestern U.S. if something makes landfall over portions of Mexico and makes it up into the desert Southwest?
Yeah, so kind of the other side of that seesaw, right? The Atlantic can be down and the Pacific is usually up during El Nino events. We're looking at 5 to 13 tropical storms in the Pacific. The last time we had a good strong El Nino, 2015, in the Pacific, the Central Pacific had 14 tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes. They had 3 major hurricanes simultaneously. And that was the last time we had a really good strong El Nino in the Pacific without any counterbalancing kind of Atlantic conditions. So that's serving as a pretty good analog. We're probably an upper limit for what we'd see at the Central Pacific. So that's why our forecast was up to 13 in the Central Pacific. East Pacific also could see some storms. They've already had 3 so far this year. They're relatively short-lived, but the Southwest U.S. could be under threat, especially later in the season. You get more of those storms, and it just starts pushing moisture up the west coast of Mexico. Then every storm can kind of just push more moisture up the Gulf of California and into the Southwest. And those late season flooding events can be pretty devastating out there.
Now, I asked this same question to Dr. Klotzbach yesterday, and I'm interested on your interpretation.
Mhm.
Sometimes when you get an El Nino developing, it takes a little while for the feedback to reach the atmosphere to kind
Yep.
of, play off of that El Nino. Do you find that the stronger the El Nino, the quicker the atmosphere responds, or is there a bit of a lag still?
Both. So the lag doesn't go away. It just gets less of a lag. Um, and it'll need, the stronger the event, right? So it's really not only the strength of the event at the peak, but it's kind of how fast the event develops, how early in the year it develops, right? So we're looking at it's June now, and we're already in an El Nino state. Other years that we've had El Nino during the hurricane season, we haven't declared that until July or August. So you didn't really have those full effects in the Atlantic. But we're so fast up in it this year that you can get those impacts, even if we don't peak out just as strong. So even if we only get to 1.8 instead of getting over to that over 2, being that we're in the El Nino this part of the year already before the Atlantic hurricane season. So those lags impacts are there, but it's really the speed with which you come into it, not really the intensity that you hit eventually.
Interesting. All right, one last question before we wrap things up. Venturing outside of hurricane season, we're looking at the peak of the El Nino, the strength of it coming in late in the fall, just after the peak of the season. What kind of implications would this have, past hurricane season? What are we looking at for the winter season, potentially? I know El Ninos, as they drag in, they usually lead to some pretty impactful weather situations. So what are your thoughts on that?
So we usually see more activity, storm activity, really in that November, December, January, really December, January, and February is when you start to see that real change in the storm track, where you'll see more storms kind of coming across Texas. Low pressure systems there, and then they hit the Gulf, get a lot of moisture, and they kind of will really intensify, move across to northern Florida, and then up the East Coast. So you can get a good bit of nor'easters that kind of come at, have their roots down as Gulf lows and Gulf storms. So that storm track is very active during El Nino years. Also, some late season rains, February, March, can come into California, as their wet season can really intensify during that time period. It's really Southern California, LA, San Diego. It signals a little bit less for Northern California. So those are some of the more impactful ways. But you can also see a lot warmer temperatures too in the winter. Past couple of El Nino events, most of the country ended up with either slightly above normal or above normal temperatures. So you can kind of reduce heating bills and heating costs. So there's always some trade-offs with these events. Just having the information now can let us plan for that later.
Yeah, with a stormier pattern, maybe that's a saving grace because along the eastern seaboard, we've got a pretty terrible drought that's taken hold, and it doesn't look to be breaking anytime soon. So maybe that wet pattern as we get into the fall and winter will be finally level things off for us. Matthew Rosenkrantz
Yeah.
over at NOAA, really appreciate your time tonight. The El Nino expert, we appreciate your input, and hopefully we'll talk to you again throughout the season later on. Thanks a lot. All right, we'll be right back after a quick break. Welcome back to Hurricane Hub Live. All right, let's get into it. Let's talk about the tropics. Most of the Atlantic quiet out there still. We've got one area of interest. We'll talk about that. It's a low chance of some development, but it's something to talk about. And I also want to hit on, where do we typically look in the Atlantic basin? It's huge. Where do we look in certain times of the season for development? In this particular instance, in June, where do we find the most development? We'll get into that. And after an active start in the Pacific, remember, we're closing in on a month so far of the Eastern Pacific season being underway. Starts about 2.5 weeks before the Atlantic, May 15th. And we've already had 3 named storms out there, but now it has turned quiet. Here's the Atlantic season. Climatology, of course, ramping things up as we hit August. The main development region opens up for business, and we see an influx of activity in the Atlantic basin. Pretty much stays that way through September and starts to wind down through October and winds down completely by late November when the season comes to an end November 30th. Typically, we see our first named storm in the Atlantic basin on or around June 20th, and then the second not coming for about a month later until the middle of July. But when we look at the first named storm over the past 10 years, we'll start with 2024. Last year's was June 23rd, so close to that normal start date. 2024 was June 19th, and then pretty much every year after, we were well before that June 20th typical start date. I mean, you go back to 2021, it was in May, same in 2020. We had a very active year in 2020, and then in 2017, it was in April. And then look at 2016. What was going on there? Well, this was typically, it could be just a carryover from the previous season, but this was actually a hurricane in January, Hurricane Alex in the northern Atlantic, an anomaly, but it did count as the first named storm of the season there on January the 12th in 2015. 2015, it was May the 8th. Now, when's our first hurricane typically? Again, you got to wait for the conditions to get a little bit better in terms of how much warm water is available and overall atmospheric conditions for storms to survive long enough to intensify hurricane status. Typically, that happens around or before or after August the 11th. And then if it gets Category 3 or greater, major hurricane, that's usually around the 1st of September. And of course, the peak right around September the 10th. So where do we look for tropical activity or tropical development in June? Well, you got to go to the Gulf. That's always going to be a hot spot. No matter what part of the season you're at, it's always pretty much open for business. And we see development here possible thanks to the Central American gyre. We've talked about this on this program before. Big spinning area of low pressure that can spit out a baby spin into the southern Gulf, the Bay of Campeche, and if conditions warrant, it could develop and then make landfall in portions of Mexico or in southeast Texas. Western Caribbean is also open for business this time of the year. We can typically see also CAG activity, Central American gyre, throwing some spin out in that direction as well. And then sometimes it moves over the Yucatan and enters the Gulf. And then an area that typically has some activity in June is going to be the far southwestern Atlantic over the Bahamas, off the east coast of Florida, the southeast coast of the U.S. Notice all these development areas are close to land. We haven't really opened up the rest of the basin just yet because conditions are still relatively hostile. Dust, temperatures of the ocean not really all that warm just yet, and they have to take some time to get there before things open up a little bit farther off towards the east. Sea surface temperature anomalies out there right now. We just talked to Matthew about this. We're not seeing anomalies that are that significantly higher than where we've been in the past. So if they were warmer, that could possibly negate the impacts of the El Nino that's growing, but not seeing that out here right now. So likely the signal for El Nino will dominate the Atlantic basin. At least that's the thinking right now. You can see the anomalously warm temperatures here along the equatorial regions in the Pacific, a sign that the El Nino is present and will get stronger as we go throughout the rest of the season. That's going to lead to an influx in activity in the eastern Pacific, which you can tell is already cooking and very warm. Plenty of energy there for storms to develop further. Atlantic basin satellite imagery, not much to talk about. There's nothing going on out in the basin, mostly with the exception of the far southern portion of the Bay of Campeche. We've got one area here that could possibly develop, low chance, 10% chance here. This is the residual energy from what was Tropical Storm Christina, sitting over Central America, Yucatan Peninsula, and Mexico right now. And if it does build into the southern Gulf, conditions there are marginally favorable for it to possibly get its act together, tighten on up its circulation, and maybe we get a tropical depression out of it. If the outside chance that we get a named storm, the first name on the list would be Arthur for this year. This is the 2020 list. And the 2014 list, remember, it's a 6-year rotation here. So the last time Arthur came around was in 2020, and before that, it was actually a hurricane on 4th of July weekend in 2014. And then we go through the entire list. And remember Isaias and Hannah from 2020? Both of those were hurricanes that caused some big problems. And then we got Kyle, Leon, Marco, and Nana as we wrap up the second list there. All right, coming up after a quick break, we're going to go into the Pacific Basin. I want to talk more about the remnants of Christina, that if it does cross basins, again, coming from the Eastern Pacific, moving to the Atlantic, what happens? Does it maintain Christina, or do we get Arthur out of it? We'll go through the details after a quick break. Welcome back, folks. Let's revisit Central America for the remnant circulation, really, of what once was Tropical Storm Christina just a couple days ago. You can see the generalized spin here. It is built in and almost been absorbed into the Central American gyre that's currently in place there. It's common this time here. But you can see the northern portion of the Yucatan, that it looks somewhat favorable. I mean, we got some spin there, and as that moves back over open water, I mean, the 10% chance currently put on by the National Hurricane Center, I mean, maybe they're going to up that over the next day or so. Now, last runs that we got on the plots here was back when it was still a tropical depression, but that was just about less than 24 hours ago. So look at the tracks on this, moving over land and then entering the southern Gulf, the Bay of Campeche, and then eventually tracking towards maybe Brownsville, Texas, or just south of there into Mexico if it does get its act together. That's the current trajectory on it. But what happens if that storm that once was Christina redevelops in a different basin, the Atlantic? Well, these are called cross-basin tropical systems. Now, it would keep the same name, which would be Christina, if the surface circulation survives the land crossing. Right now, that doesn't look to be the case. It looks like if we do get this circulation, it would almost be the seed of a new surface circulation. It would get a new name, which would be Arthur in the Atlantic list. That's if that surface circulation dissipates crossing over land, which it looks like it's doing. I don't know if it's all there in all layers of the atmosphere. We'll have to see what the Hurricane Center says, but it looks like it would probably get a new name in this instance. Now, the Eastern Pacific, we've gone through three of these names already. Amanda, Boris, and of course, Christina was the last one. Douglas would be up next, but there's no other areas of interest out there in the Eastern Pacific as of now, so things turning quiet for the foreseeable future in not only the Eastern Pacific, but also the Atlantic, with the exception of what may happen in the Southern Gulf. We'll keep tabs on that, but coming up after a quick break, we've got HHL Trivia, the answer to yesterday's question, and I got a brand new question for you later on. All right, welcome back. Time for HHL Trivia. Yesterday, I posed the question to you. The term potential tropical cyclone, PTC, was introduced by the National Hurricane Center in what year? 99, 2017, 92, or 2020? That year was 2017, the year of Hurricane Harvey. By the way, PTC 1, the first time ever issued. The storm that came out of that was Tropical Storm Brett in 2017. All right, here's today's question. Where is the headquarters of the U.S. Air Force 53rd Weather Recon Squadron, or better known as the Hurricane Hunters? Is it Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, Biloxi, Mississippi, U.S. Virgin Islands, or in Miami, Florida? I'll have the answer for you tomorrow night on HHL. In the meantime, scan the QR code to download the 13 News Now Hurricane Guide, and we'll see you tomorrow at 8.